exception and why I think understanding what you have is such an important part of what we do. This is a reference model. Basically says this is something you may have in your organization already. If not, it's kind of a handy thing to have available when you're doing electronic discovery, mapping, whatever it happens to be. It's classifying your different systems based on the type of system that they are. So in the top row, we have databases. We've got wikis and blogs. There might be a couple of those in tech support or in development. We have ECRM systems out there. There may be some SharePoint or other systems. We have the shared drives, which everybody puts content into, and then there's hard copy, and the hard copy's been there for years and years. So I want to change this picture just a little bit, and this is what it looks like based on how much we actually know about each of these repositories. You'll notice that all of these things grew except for the M drive. We know a lot about, if you have a system, a database system out there, we know who the users are, we know how big the database is, we know how many records there are, we know huge amounts of information about the structure of that database or that wiki blog or that ECRM system. But what we don't really know is much about the M drive. What is on the M drive? Who owns it? How many orphaned records are there? How many duplicates are there? There's just a lot of stuff out there that we classify into this bucket of saying it's the shared drive, and it gets backed up and restored the same way as everything else, but it's getting backed up with all those pictures of the bar mitzvah and the birthday party, and they're getting backed up with all kinds of other stuff in there. So I'm going to change the picture one more time. This is based on how much of your enterprise content actually resides on these systems. This was from an AIM study for a couple years ago, but it basically said a lot of your content, a lot of your knowledge, a lot of your corporate information, and everything you know as an enterprise is sitting on this thing, which you really know very little about. So that's kind of what we want to do when we approach analytics, is to figure out what we have and figure out what to do with it. You probably heard in a number of discussions about the fact that you want to have legal and IT and RM and the business involved. Well, this is a broader perspective on that. All of these disciplines that you see out there sit within one of those four areas, but it's more than just those four areas. You want to be concerned with, when you're cleaning up and organizing and figuring out what's on your shared drives and doing something about it, compliance policies. What is your overall policy for information management? What are you doing with that? Taking into account any sort of enterprise content management systems that are out there. So for example, there may be some standard enterprise metadata for your enterprise content system. Knowing that when you're jumping into an analysis process for your shared drives is important, because then you can start looking for, oh, look at all the ways we call something a draft. And maybe we can be consistent about what we call a draft when we move it into something. So looking at the ICM tools, that's been my term for what we're talking about here, analytics today. It stands for Index and Classification Management Tools, and that's a Gartner term. But I think Mr. Miller came up with a different term in the session yesterday for computer-assisted classification that also works. It doesn't really matter so much what you call it. It's just knowing that there are tools that will help you build that infrastructure and the scaffolding around your shared drive content, so that when you move it, you've got some place to move it, something to move it with, and something to do with it. So understanding taxonomies, bringing in the records managers, obviously. Image conversion is a large part of what migration is about. Not necessarily that you're moving images, but understanding that you're moving it from point A to point B with a database alongside of it, so that there's index tags that go in with it. And then finally, and probably most importantly, the preservation side, so that you're protecting the information that needs to be protected, so you're not deleting discoverable, preservable content that's out there. This is an overall program approach. It really depends a lot on your organization, the overall approach that you're going to take to it. But this is the approach overall that works for very, very large organizations. And so what you try to do is find the steps that are repeatable, and how big of a group can you build that repeatability out of. So the general idea is, if I found stuff that needed to be deleted and I went to each and every individual within your organization to either classify a record or decide whether a picture shouldn't be stored on the server or whatever it happens to be, that's a very, very accurate, but as we saw earlier, very tedious and not very cost-effective way to go about doing that. The other side is to say we're going to make a blanket approach and just delete everything we think is garbage. That also might not be very accurate. You may annoy a lot of people by doing that. So you want to find the right balance of, let's make a decision. What's the highest level we can make that decision within the enterprise? And generally that tends to be either a share level decision, so the owner of a share, or a work group decision, so the owner of a work group, which may be your records liaisons or records coordinators, however that happens to be. So, and that ranges somewhere between 100 and 500 people. So the first part is to set up your strategy and governance and policy. Make sure the legal, RM, everybody's involved. Because what you're going to find is, you're going through this content, you're going to find stuff, oh, by the way, here's some credit card information sitting on the shared drive. Well, you talk to IT, they may not know why that would be important or not important, but if you talk to compliance, they're going to go, hey, wait, I wish you told me you're going to be looking at this because I've got some concerns about that. We want to do something about that. So making sure all the people are there ahead of time to say, this is what my requirement is for what we're doing. And probably the most important one, that a group that always has lots of policies out there, although they generally deny that they make policy, is the IT department. Right? They generally say, no, we're not involved. You set the policies, you set the requirements, we're just here to implement. Oh, and by the way, you can't download anything from the internet and install it on your servers. Well, there's a policy, and if I can work that policy into what I'm doing to find applications that shouldn't have been downloaded, or even worse, something like an iTunes library that was downloaded 10 years ago that's still out there, whatever that happens to be, having them involved and have them take responsibility and ownership, because they are the huge beneficiaries of a lot of this results. And so having IT involved, think about who's going to benefit and have them involved and have them pay for it.